Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're watching this from in the world. My name is Andeline dos Santos, and I'll be discussing ethical empathies in music therapy training and beyond. I began studying empathy and violence in the context of music therapy a few years ago. Looking back, I see that I started out with some simplistic and naive ideas around violence as bad and empathy as good. We should work to decrease the first and increase the latter. Now I know that violence is complex and it includes aspects that need to be understood in terms of how they function adaptively so that we can fully receive and compassionately work with clients who present this way. I've also learned that empathy is profoundly multifaceted. It can be expressed in highly ethical ways, but also in violent ways. The use of the term empathy in its singular form is still widespread, but I'd argue that this is incomplete and unhelpful. There are about 43 different definitions of empathy within current literature. A challenge is to recognize the many facets of the phenomenon whilst not inviting such vast conceptual spread that the idea comes apart altogether. 6 types of empathy emerge prominently in current literature within the broad fields of human and social development, therapeutic approaches, and psychopathology. These are motor mimicry, largely overlapping with the concepts of embodied empathy and kinesthetic empathy, affective empathy, cognitive empathy, cultural empathy, and social empathy. The notion of musical empathy has also been explored within musicology, music psychology, music education, and music therapy. Empathy is referred to specifically in music therapy literature in a variety of ways, as you can see here. Sometimes the type of empathy referred to isn't specifically defined, and in some studies it's evoked in more blended forms. Empathy is key in the entirety of ethical decision-making. REST proposed an ethical decision-making process that is still drawn upon today. It includes awareness and recognition of a moral issue, evaluation of the information and of alternatives, the intention to act, and behavioral follow-through. Empathy facilitates the whole of this process by informing moral recognition, judgment and evaluation, intention and action. Some studies indicate that the greater an individual's ability to take the perspective of others, the more likely she or he is to form ethical intentions. These perspectives on the close relationship between empathy and ethics are contentious, though. Bloom has argued, for example, that moral concerns and empathy are not necessarily synonymous. In fact, they can clash. Empathy typically entails a focus on people in one's immediate vicinity and on the here and now. Empathy favors individuals over larger social groups. It can be biased and informed by racism, for example. Empathy can inspire violence, as observed in wars, motivated by the protection of people like us against the others. Higher levels of empathy have been positively associated with violent behavior. Empathic mimicry can stimulate distress in an observer, which can then provoke aggression. An increased capacity for perspective taking has also been associated with greater relational violence as a result of empathic sadism. Empathic vampirism refers to a situation where the empathizer experiences the world vicariously through others without having their best interests at heart. As an effortful act, empathy can also be psychologically costly, and as a result, humans may prefer to avoid empathy. Also, if we are simply projecting our own view, then this is closer to silencing, appropriation, or violence. Different theoretical orientations lead us to rather different understandings of empathy. For example, seeing another as a separate, bounded individual who one may attempt to empathize with may itself be a violent act. Gergen argued that relationships are ontological, and a self is an emergent property of relationships. As such, empathy is less about trying to put oneself in the shoes of another separate self, and more about exploring a relational process that is becoming between us. When one's connectivity is real and apparent, it is more difficult to do harm to the other. Alternatively, another theoretical perspective values acknowledging separation and difference. Chloe Hesse, for example, wrote of ethics as involving a process of leaving home. The unsettling aspect of the empathic experience of difference is of the utmost ethical significance, because ultimately ethics must be about guiding us away from the familiarity and security of home to the more unfamiliar and inhospitable terrain of difference. Ethical engagement requires not only valuing a world in which other worlds are possible, but allowing and even participating in the thriving of those worlds. Grappling with ethics is an intrinsic part of music therapy training. An ethical classroom becomes a relational space where connections among habituated ways of knowing, coming to know, and being are more fluid than fixed, more open than determined. Learning takes place through engaging with ethical deliberations, as these are situated within socio-historical claims regarding what knowledge is, what can be known, and how we can access this knowledge. As a music therapy lecturer, I spent last year diving into an exploration of empathy with my master's students. In the study, the students and I critically explored various experiential encounters, projects, discussions, and reflections on clinical practice. The study was guided by the questions: what kind of empathies are produced and reflected upon here? And in what ways could these empathic engagements and reflections be considered as ethical or not? Through thematic analysis of the data, 5 kinds of empathies emerged. Empathy towards the self, resonant empathy, which incorporated affective and kinesthetic forms, reflective empathy, which linked to cognitive and psychological empathy, translational empathy, and relational empathy. Importantly, each of these empathies were expressed in both more ethical and more violent forms, and I'll discuss this further in a moment. Identification and shared situations also emerged as related concepts. Identification arose as experiences of having the sense of another person being the same as oneself in terms of a or many key features, or as having the same experience that one has had personally. Whilst there can be some overlaps with empathies, identification retains a focus on the self. Being in a shared situation did not imply that one was necessarily having an empathic response towards the person that one was sharing the situation with. Today I'll be focusing specifically on the different forms of empathy that emerged and their varied expressions. As I looked closely at each type of empathy that was reflected in the data and investigated how they were being expressed in these more ethical and more violent forms, I considered Carl Rogers' description of empathy. This is a well-known one. According to Rogers, empathy involves entering the private world of the other and becoming thoroughly at home in it. It involves being sensitive to the changing felt meanings which flow in this person. It means temporarily living in his or her life, moving about in it delicately without making judgments, sensing meanings of which he or she is scarcely aware. To be with another in this way means that for the time being you lay aside the views and values you hold for yourself in order to enter the world without prejudice. I realized that the different forms of empathies that were emerging in my data could be described through reconfiguring this definition, both in their ethical forms and in their more violent forms. This table, that you are probably struggling to see on the slide, but I'll zoom in a moment, shows a map of empathies that I've developed. Each of the 5 types are included, and on the left is a summary of their more ethical form, while on the right is a summary of their more violent form. Each type of empathy can be considered as a path. We walk along each path between more ethical and more violent expressions. The map invites critical considerations of these multiple empathies, as they may be more and less appropriate in different contexts, in relation to different theoretical orientations, and in terms of their use within different practices. Rather than presenting different empathies in a hierarchical structure, the map is flat, offering the strengths of different empathies in light of different aims and different forms of relating. So let's look at this map a bit more closely. As a music therapist, it may be relevant to ask oneself whether one is willing to and well versed at dwelling within one's own life world. It is necessary to exercise self-empathy in order to be able to offer empathy to others. According to Bruscher, music therapy is a reflexive process in which we need to make continuous efforts to bring into awareness, evaluate, and, when necessary, modify our work with the client. This is achieved through activities such as self-observation and self-inquiry. When dwelling in one's own life world, in order to observe and inquire is practiced ethically. This entails self-kindness instead of harsh criticism, an awareness of common humanity, and mindfulness instead of avoidance. Dwelling within one's own life world can, however, take on different qualities. Some that ethically leave room for recognition that others may dwell in their own life worlds differently, and others that more violently assume that the view that one's personal experience is the only valid one. Music was highlighted as being particularly evocative of emotional and embodied responses. As we sense and share in the emotional and embodied experience of the other through resonant empathy, and loosen our grip on our own prior state to share in the state of another with vulnerability, it appears that this can occur with greater and lesser awareness of who the experience originally belongs to. Participants in this study raised concerns about ensuring the psychological safety of the client as this is negotiated. Empathic over-arousal can promote self-focus, personal distress, and the desire to alleviate one's own negative feelings. More optimal levels of empathic arousal require self-regulation in order to retain an other-directed focus, even while sharing in a resonant experience. Participants asserted the importance of remaining in any discomfort that arises in the session, as this may bring insight and growth rather than attempting to escape from it or trying to pull the client away from it. Reflective empathy took shape as dwelling humbly and respectfully in the imagined life world of the other, moving about in it delicately without judgment or prejudice. Examples also emerged in the data, however, of entering the private world of the other by assuming that one understands their experience, and simply bringing one's own biases, personal beliefs, and personal discomforts to bear on the encounter. A number of strategies were experienced as helpful, such as listening to other stories, listening carefully to the quality of the client's silence, becoming familiar with another's context and with the context of a piece of music, and building trusting relationships over time. Musicking within a therapeutic relationship was highlighted as being particularly useful in getting to know a client and their life world, especially when speech is limited. At times, it was only through the musical relationship that my students felt they were able to get to know their client, and through experiencing musical matching and reflection, that the client appeared able to feel known. What if I don't believe that I can stand in your shoes? Who am I to claim to understand your experiences? Empathy then may invite dwelling in the negotiated and dynamic dance of translation. We become generously aware of each other and move together communicatively with humility and curiosity, whilst recognizing similarities and connectedness, and also respecting and even enjoying difference, separateness, and complexity. Conflict and a lack of full commensurability can remain central as part of a translational empathic process. These do not need to be neutralized by empathy. Mistranslations can also be opportunities for transformation and discovery. The participants highlighted the need to recognize past and present injustice and their own roles in this in order to foster empathic relationships. Also, in addition to the quality of the therapeutic space, empathy requires participation in the creation of a just system more broadly. When a relational ontological approach is assumed, then empathy changes shape again as a process of relationally rooted becoming. Here, we do not conceive of one another as bounded selves, but are always already emerging from relationships. This relational path of empathy could be characterized by an awareness of interconnectedness and mutuality in its more ethical form, or by unequal power relations or denial of interconnectedness in its more violent form. Participants in this study explored how their views, behaviors, and experiences were shaped through their interactions with others. As higher levels of empathy have been significantly associated with better therapeutic outcomes in health professions, it would be remiss of us as music therapy practitioners and educators not to be intentional about creating spaces to explore and practice empathy. Crucially, though, the notion of empathy itself requires critical examination. It is not a unitary phenomenon, and it is not only a pro-social and ethical form of engagement. I've developed a version of this map that serves as a reflexive tool for practitioners and students to use in their work. Broadly, it invites questions about what form or forms of empathies may be most appropriate in a given context and why this may be the case. How does a particular empathy path serve the needs of the client? How does walking along this path assist in moving the process towards its therapeutic aims? How does a certain path align with one's value system and theoretical orientation? How might a type of empathy that is being expressed by the music therapist be experienced by the client? It also invites specific questions as one looks more closely at each of the paths. In relation to empathy towards the self, how am I dwelling in my own life world? In a situation, am I entering my own world and becoming thoroughly at home in it? How does the way I dwell or don't dwell in my own life world relate to my relationships with others? In terms of resonant empathy, how am I dwelling in the experience of the emotional state of another person? How am I dwelling in the qualities of the embodied presence of this person? In a particular situation, am I sharing in the emotional and embodied world of the other and becoming immersed in it? Am I sensitive to the open to the changing feelings and movements which flow in this person? Or am I sharing in the emotional and embodied world of the other and becoming overwhelmed by it, such that I'm becoming lost in my own experience at their expense? In relation to reflective empathy, how am I dwelling humbly and respectfully in the imagined life world of this person? How am I moving about in his or her life delicately, without making judgments and without prejudice? Or am I entering the private world of the other and assuming that I am thoroughly at home in it? Am I moving about in their life forcefully, clumsily, or with judgment? In relation to translational empathy, How are we dwelling in the negotiated and dynamic dance of translation? Are we both becoming generously aware of each other and each other's worlds according to how we each choose to share this, and becoming thoroughly open to developing dynamic ways of understanding each other? Or, as we negotiate the dynamic process of translational empathy, are one or both of us experiencing the other as too forceful or too distant, too invasive or too invested? Are we really working with and towards collaborative generosity? In terms of relational empathy, how are we dwelling in shared, mutual, relationally rooted becoming? How are we realizing our mutuality and interconnectedness without prejudice? How are we open to affecting and being affected by each other? Or are we becoming through unequal power relations that support my perceived superiority, power relations that I've become thoroughly at home in? And am I moving about in this relationship with moral authority, reinforcing meanings that I've already produced? My hope is that understanding empathy more deeply and practicing empathy with more awareness, critical thinking, and humility will contribute to our increasingly ethical and compassionate practice as music therapists. Thank you for your time today.